Rain doesn't care who you are. It hit the windshield of a rusted Ford F-150 the same way it hit the hood of a $200,000 Jaguar sitting dead on the shoulder of a dark Atlanta road. Equal, indifferent, relentless. The man who stopped didn't have to. He was already late, already dreading where he was going, already carrying 47,000 reasons to keep driving and not look back. He stopped anyway, and the woman inside, the woman who controlled billions, who had dismantled boardrooms with a single sentence, who had never once needed anyone to fix anything for her, lowered her window exactly 2 inches, not 3, 2. What happened in the next 10 minutes on that empty road, in the dark, in the rain, while neither of them knew who the other was? That was the part nobody saw coming. Not them, not the people waiting at the restaurant. Not the man who had already decided to use both of them. The engine turned over. She handed him something. And without knowing it, without knowing anything at all, they drove away toward the same table. Rain came down hard on Atlanta. Not the soft kind. Not the kind that made you want to stay in bed with coffee and old music. The kind that hit the roof of a pickup truck like it had a personal grudge. The kind that turned the highway into a river and made a man question every decision that led him to this exact moment, sitting in a 1999 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard clock, a borrowed tie, and $47,000 of debt he couldn't outrun. Darnell Cooper was that man, 34 years old. Hands that knew the inside of an engine better than the inside of a restaurant menu. Wearing a charcoal suit he hadn't touched since his father's funeral. And before that, his own wedding. Both times, things had gone badly afterward. He was starting to think the suit was cursed. Starting to think he should have burned it when he had the chance. He gripped the wheel tighter. The tie was Lorraine's idea. The whole night was Lorraine's idea. His sister had called him that afternoon, while he was elbow-deep in a '72 Cadillac Eldorado that needed a new fuel pump and a small miracle. She hadn't said hello. Lorraine never said hello. She launched directly into whatever was on her mind, like a woman who'd long ago decided that pleasantries were a waste of perfectly good confrontation time. You're going tonight. Not a question. A verdict. Darnell had kept working. I'm going nowhere tonight. I've got 3 cars behind schedule and a bank letter I haven't opened yet because I already know what it says. Darnell James Cooper, the full name. He hated the full name. Her name is Monica. Monica Reed. She's sharp, she's serious, and she does not need a man who owns a boat or talks about his investment portfolio for 45 minutes straight. She needs someone real. You're real. That's literally your only job tonight. Show up and be real, Lorraine. 7 o'clock. Noir room downtown, the reservation's under Reed. Just tell them Monica Reed at the door and they'll take care of the rest. Don't you dare make me a liar? She'd hung up before he could argue further, which was also classic Lorraine. She ended conversations the way she ended arguments, decisively and without appeal. So here he was, suit, tie, $47,000 of quiet desperation he was trying not to let show on his face. Driving toward a restaurant where a single appetizer probably cost more than his weekly grocery run, to meet a woman he already knew in his bones, was going to look at him the way they always looked at him once they found out what he did for a living. Not mean about it, never mean, worse. Polite about it. The careful smile that said, I'm sure that's very noble, while the eyes did the math, and came up short. He'd seen it enough times to recognize it the moment it started. The slight recalibration. The way the questions got shallower. The way the rest of the evening became a performance of politeness that fooled nobody, least of all him. He'd rather be under the Cadillac. I-285 backed up without warning. Brake lights stretched ahead of him as far as he could see. A chain of red that disappeared into the curtain of rain. Darnell checked the clock. 6:20. He had 40 minutes and apparently the entire city of Atlanta between him and the Noir room. He took the next exit without thinking twice. Old habit. He'd grown up cutting through the back roads around Buckhead with his father, James Cooper, who had known every shortcut in this city the way he knew every bolt in an engine. Precisely, confidently, without needing to consult anything. James Cooper had been that kind of man, the kind who moved through the world like he understood the mechanics of it. Like he'd taken it apart once, seen how it worked. and put it back together in the right order. He'd pass that down to Darnell the same way he'd pass down the tools. Not with lectures, with repetition, with Saturday mornings in the garage, and the smell of motor oil and the sound of a radio playing old soul music, while they worked side by side on cars that other people had given up on Cooper restorations. Est, 1987. The wooden sign still hung above the bay doors of the shop on West End. James had painted it himself, careful letters, the kind of careful that meant something. Darnell had repainted it twice since taking over. Same font, same color, because some things you don't change just because time passes. The bank didn't see it that way. The bank saw an asset with diminishing returns on a piece of West End real estate, whose value had been quietly climbing for 3 years, while the business above it struggled to keep pace. They'd been patient. Patient had a number, $47,000, and a deadline Darnell was no longer able to pretend wasn't coming. He pushed it out of his mind. Tonight wasn't about the bank. Tonight was about surviving 2 hours across a table from a woman named Monica Reed, who was apparently some kind of corporate type, which could mean anything. Could mean she ran a team of 15 people at an insurance company. Could mean she wore blazers and used words like synergy without irony. Either way. 2 hours. He could survive 2 hours. The back roads through Buckhead were dark and slick, rain hammering the windshield fast enough that the wipers could barely keep up. Darnell leaned forward slightly out of habit. The truck's defroster worked at about 60% efficiency, which was a project he kept meaning to get to and kept not getting to, because there were always other people's cars that needed attention first. That was the thing about being a mechanic. You were always the last one to fix your own. His headlights cut through the rain and caught something on the shoulder of the road, a shape, long and low and unmistakably elegant, even half swallowed by shadow. Darnell's foot came off the gas before his brain fully processed what his eyes were seeing. He slowed, and then he stopped, because parked, or rather, surrendered. On the gravel shoulder with its hood pointed slightly toward the drainage ditch was a 1969 Jaguar E-Type in British racing green. Even in the dark, even in the rain, even listing at that defeated angle. It was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in weeks, and it was clearly, completely dead. Darnell sat there for 3 full seconds. There was a person inside. He could see the silhouette through the rain-blurred glass. Someone sitting very still in the driver's seat. The posture of a person working hard to project composure. They weren't entirely feeling. He pulled over. Hazard lights on. He sat there 1 more second and thought about the time. 6:26. Noir room by 7. If he stopped, he was going to be late. Definitely late, maybe very late. And the rational, self-preserving part of him made a brief and practical argument that there were other people on this road, that this wasn't a deserted stretch of highway, that someone else. He got out of the truck. There was no version of Darnell Cooper that drove past a 69 E-Type stranded in the rain. His father would have haunted him. He jogged toward the car, jacket pulled up against the downpour, already calculating from 30 feet away. The position. The dead dashboard. No hazard lights on the Jaguar itself, which meant total electrical failure or close to it, and these old British engines, gorgeous, temperamental, completely unforgiving of moisture in the wrong place. He'd worked on enough of them to know what dark and rainy nights did to their ignition systems. He knocked on the glass. Light. 2 knuckles. Nothing for a moment, then the window lowered. 2 inches. Exactly 2 inches. The gap of a person who had made a decision to allow minimal information exchange with a stranger, while retaining the option to close the gap immediately. You okay in there? Rain dripped from his hairline down the bridge of his nose. I'm completely fine. The voice that came through the 2-inch gap was controlled. Precise. The kind of voice that had spent years being the steadiest one in difficult rooms. My support is already on the way. Darnell glanced at the dashboard. No light. No glow. The radio was off because the radio had no power, which meant the whole car had no power, which meant no one had been called because there was nothing to call without here. In this dead zone where the topography ate cell signals for dinner. Your support is going to have a hard time getting here. I-285 is backed up from the Cascade exit, and you've got no signal in this stretch. There's a low point in the terrain about a quarter-mile back that kills everything. He paused. Let that land. I'm gonna look at the engine. Pop the hood. A beat of silence. Excuse me. The hood release. Should be a lever to your left under the dash. He said it evenly. Not unkind. Not asking permission so much as offering clear information about what was about to happen. It's a 69 E-type. I know what's wrong. It'll take me 10 minutes. Another beat. Longer this time. He could feel her weighing it. He didn't rush her. A woman alone on a dark road at night had earned the right to weigh it carefully. And he respected that in the same direct way he respected the Jaguar. You didn't force either one. The hood released. He walked to the front of the car. Long clamshell hood, the E-type signature, hinged at the front and lifting forward to reveal the entire front end at once. Engine, radiator, the whole complicated, beautiful, very wet interior of a 60-year-old British sports car that had not been designed with Atlanta rainstorms in mind. Darnell pulled a small flashlight from his coat pocket. He always had one, occupational habit. He found it more embarrassing not to have one than to explain why he was carrying it to a dinner date. He put the light on the distributor cap. There it was. He heard the car door open. Heard heels on wet gravel. Then a large umbrella appeared over him. Over him and the open engine bay, held by a woman who had stepped out into the rain not because anyone asked her to, but because she decided she wasn't going to sit inside while someone else handled her problem. He glanced up. Got a partial impression, a woman in something dark and carefully constructed, holding the umbrella with the steady grip of someone accustomed to managing things. Water already beginning to darken the hem of her dress. She wasn't looking at him with gratitude or relief. She was looking at the engine with focused attention, like she was trying to understand what she was looking at rather than waiting for someone to explain it to her. He found that interesting. Distributor cap. He kept his voice even, technical, because that was the register he trusted. Moisture got into the casing. Kills the spark. These old British inline sixes run like a dream in dry weather and throw a tantrum the second the humidity goes wrong. He worked while he talked. Careful, efficient, hands moving through the process of removing the cap, drying the contacts, working the moisture out. You were probably fine for the first mile or two, and then it just gave up. Can it be fixed here? Not a question. An assessment. Like she was already calculating what came next and needed the variable confirmed or ruled out, temporarily. Enough to get you to a garage. He wiped his hands on the dry rag from his back pocket. Always had one of those too. You're lucky. I'm standing in a rainstorm in a ruined dress. Lucky is a strong word. Lucky because I drive this route. Because I know this engine. Because I happened to leave later than I should have, which made me take this road, which put me behind you at exactly the right time. He began reassembling. Careful with the cap. Careful with the contacts. 5 minutes earlier or later, and you're out here until your signal comes back, which is probably 2 miles north of here. Silence. The rain against the umbrella. The sound of his hands working. You know this engine. Not skepticism. Recalibration. I've rebuilt 3 of them. This generation, the inline 6, before they switched to the V12 in 71. The V12 is faster, but the 6 has more character. He tightened the last contact. The 6 sounds like it means it. Another silence. Shorter, you're a mechanic. I have a shop. West End. My father started it in 87. He closed the hood. That satisfying heavy click of the clamshell settling back into place. We specialize in restoration. Old American iron mostly. But I've done my share of vintage European work. He stepped back. Get in and try her. The woman moved. He heard the door open. Heard her settle into the driver's seat with the practiced economy of someone who'd been driving this car long enough to know its geometry. A pause. Then the key, the engine turned. Coughed. Caught. That particular sound. An E-type inline 6 waking up after being convinced it was done for the night. Was one of his favorite sounds in the world. Low and authoritative and slightly annoyed. Like something that had been interrupted and decided to make the best of it regardless. She stepped back out. She was taller than he'd estimated. Her face in the weak light from the Jaguar's now functioning dash. Composed, direct, with sharp eyes that moved over him once and then held steady. She wasn't doing the grateful stranger thing. She was doing something more like an assessment, which he found considerably more comfortable than gratitude. She held out a folded square of silk, white with embroidered initials in one corner. "MR, for your hands." He looked at it, looked at his hands, the grease from the distributor cap, the rain-mixed grime from an honest 10 minutes of work. "I'll wreck it, it's already a casualty. Take it." He took it. The fabric was finer than anything he'd held in recent memory. He used it on his hands with the careful economy of a man who understood the value of things, and also knew when an offer was genuine. He noticed the initials. MR filed them away in the back of his mind without examining why. "I'm Monica." She said it the way people say their names when they want the name to be what it is. Not an invitation, not a title, just a name, Darnell. He folded the cloth carefully. "Drive safe out here. Take the corners slow. The rear traction on these old cars isn't built for wet asphalt. You should get it to a shop this week," he added. "What's under that hood is beautiful, but it's not forgiving." "Which shop?" she said. Not a question. The same assessment register she'd used throughout. Cooper Restorations, West End. "Look it up." He opened the truck door. "Drive safe, Monica. Good luck with wherever you're going." A pause. Brief, almost imperceptible. "You look like you're headed somewhere you'd rather not be." He stopped with one hand on the door. She was right. He probably did look like that. He'd been looking like that for 2 hours. He turned back once, just for a second. Blind date. My sister's idea. Her name's Monica, apparently. Corporate type. He shook his head, slightly. "Probably going to spend the whole dinner calculating what I'm worth and finding the number disappointing." Something shifted across Monica's face. Not her expression. Her expression didn't move. Something behind it. Something that recalculated fast and then went still again. "Maybe she's not calculating anything," she said. "Maybe she's just tired. Maybe she's been surrounded by people who tell her what she wants to hear all day, and she'd give a lot for one honest conversation." He looked at her for a moment. Rain between them. Engine ticking as it settled. "Maybe." He got in the truck. "Drive slow." She didn't answer. He pulled away. The Jaguar's headlights grew smaller in his rearview mirror, then disappeared around the curve. He drove the last stretch to the noir room, thinking about the way she'd said it. Maybe she's just tired. The specificity of that. Not maybe she's nice, or maybe you'll like her, but tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who had named a feeling they recognized in themselves. The word had come out before she'd decided whether to say it, which was the kind of thing you noticed when you were paying attention. He filed that away too, without knowing why. The noir room was everything Darnell had feared, and a few things he hadn't thought to fear. The exterior was understated. Black facade, small gold lettering, a single lamp over a door that opened before you reached it because someone inside was watching for the kind of people who came here. He was not that kind of people. He came here because Lorraine had made him, and because the alternative was going home to an unopened bank letter and leftover mac and cheese. He told the man at the door the name Lorraine had given him. It's under Reed. Monica Reed, the host, tall, immaculate, wearing the expression of a man who had seen every variety of human inadequacy and categorized each one with clinical precision, looked at Darnell's damp suit, his water-spotted shoes, his hands that still carried the faint ghost of distributor cap grease despite the silk handkerchief. Something moved behind the man's eyes. Nothing you could call out directly. Just a slight adjustment, of course. Miss Reed's table. Right this way. The interior was the kind of room that made you feel your own clothes. Not loud about it, the opposite. The quiet confidence of a space that didn't need to say anything, because the crystal chandelier and the white linen and the string quartet in the corner said it all without effort. Darnell walked through it feeling like a man who'd wandered into the wrong film. The booth was in the back corner, overlooking rain-streaked windows that faced a stretch of downtown Atlanta lit gold through the water. It was a nice view. Darnell didn't enjoy it because he'd just opened the menu, and the number next to the filet mignon had stopped his train of thought completely. $195. For a steak. He closed the menu, opened it again to confirm he'd read it correctly. He had $60 in his wallet. He had a maxed card he was trying not to use. He had a warm and vivid imagination, and right now it was painting a very specific picture of the moment the check arrived. and the various ways the evening could collapse from that point. He ordered water. He checked his phone. 7:14. He'd arrived late after all. The back road detour had cost him more time than he'd calculated. He stared at the screen for a moment, thought about texting Lorraine something terse, and decided against it. He looked at the empty seat across from him. Lorraine had said sharp. She'd said serious. She'd given him a last name, Reed. And he'd thought nothing of it, because Reed was a common enough name, and he hadn't been paying close attention because he'd been under the Cadillac at the time and trying to find a graceful way out of the conversation. He hadn't looked her up. He'd been too stubborn, and then too busy, and then it was 6 o'clock and he was putting on the cursed suit. He thought about the woman on the road again. Monica, the initials on the handkerchief, the specific way she'd used the word tired, and had the brief, irrational thought that in another version of tonight, he'd have preferred to stay on that dark road, talking to a stranger over whatever was about to happen in this restaurant. Then the room changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. It was the absence of something. The way a space adjusts itself around a person who has learned, through long practice, how to occupy it fully. The string quartet didn't stop playing. The conversations didn't pause, but there was a collective, subtle realignment. The way a room full of people might all take a half second to note something and then pretend they hadn't. Darnell looked up. The host was moving through the room with the specific energy of a man who had reversed all of his earlier judgments and was now moving at a considerably faster pace. And the woman walking behind him, Darnell's hand stopped moving. The water glass in his fingers tilted slightly before he caught it and set it down on the linen with deliberate care. She was wearing the same dress, the dark one, rain-hemmed, the careful construction of it still somehow intact, despite what the weather had done to the lower portion. Her hair had dried in the car. He'd wondered briefly how, and then remembered the Jaguar's heater vents running once the engine caught, and he'd driven away picturing exactly that, without knowing he was doing it. She moved through the room the way the car sounded. Controlled authority, low and certain. The kind of presence that came not from the room's attention, but from a fundamental relationship with your own center of gravity. She hadn't seen him yet. The host was guiding her to the corner booth, his corner booth. Darnell watched the exact moment she registered him, watched it travel from recognition, the shape of him, the truck on the dark road, the distributor cap and the rain, to comprehension, the booth, the restaurant, the reservation name she herself had made, and arrive at a destination she had not planned for. She stopped. One hand found the back of a nearby chair, not because she needed the support, because the information required a half second to organize before she could move forward with it. He watched. It happened. Watched her put it together at exactly the same speed he was putting it together. The name on the reservation. Reed. Her name. The handkerchief. M.R. The woman on the road who'd given her name as Monica and said maybe she's just tired with the particular certainty of someone speaking from experience. The blind date his sister had arranged, and the thing he'd said in the rain. Corporate type, probably going to spend the whole dinner calculating what I'm worth, said to a woman who was apparently, in fact, standing in this restaurant being greeted by the host like the room belonged to her. Ms. Reed, the host, oblivious to all of it. Your guest has already. Yes. Monica had recovered by the time the host finished his sentence. Thank you, Thomas. Thomas retreated with the energy of a man who suddenly sensed he was peripheral to something. Monica came to the table, sat down across from Darnell, put her hands flat on the linen, and looked at him with the expression of a person who had learned to hold many things at once, without letting any of them tip over. A beat passed. 2. Darnell spoke first. Because someone had to, and because the corner of his mouth was doing something he couldn't fully control. You're the corporate type. Monica held his gaze for one more second of perfect composure. Then something gave. Not much, just a fraction, just enough. And the sound that came out of her was a real laugh. Not the careful social laugh of a woman in a room full of people who watched her. An actual laugh, surprised out of her, undisguised, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. You're the mechanic with the struggling shop and the 7-year-old. She said it like she was reading back, a description she'd been given, and was now cross-referencing with the evidence in front of her. Who was going to spend the whole dinner watching me calculate what you're worth? I believe, I said, finding the number disappointing, the knot in his chest. The one that had been there since Lorraine called, since the bank letter, since the moment he put on this suit, came loose. Just slightly. Just enough to breathe. In my defense, I didn't know I was talking to you. In your defense, she settled back into the booth. The posture was still there. It was structural at this point, he suspected, built into her spine over years. But something around the edges of it had relaxed by a degree. You also told your blind date she probably spends her weekends analyzing spreadsheets. The word landed before she'd finished the sentence. Darnell processed it with the stillness of a man who had learned that stillness was the best response when the ground shifted under you unexpectedly. His face didn't do anything dramatic. He simply took the word and placed it next to everything else he'd observed in the last 20 minutes. The Jaguar, the silk handkerchief, the way Thomas had transformed from skeptical to reverent. The instant she crossed the threshold and let the full picture assemble itself. Billionaire. Well, he looked at her steadily. That retroactively explains the maitre d'. Monica's mouth curved. Not the careful social version. The real one. Fractional. Contained. But there. I should tell you that my legal team has a standing policy against suing mechanics who fix my car in the rain. Specific policy. I've found it useful to be specific. The servers materialized with the leather menu, handing one to Monica, with the deference of a man who understood exactly where the center of gravity at this table was. And Darnell opened his for the second time that evening. The numbers hadn't changed. He looked at them with the calm acceptance of a man who'd already made his peace with something unpleasant and was now waiting to see how bad it got. Monica opened hers, looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. Closed it. We're not eating here. She said it the way she'd said pop the hood. Not unkind, not asking, just clear about what was going to happen next. I hate this restaurant. Darnell looked at her. You chose this restaurant. Stephanie chose this restaurant. My assistant. She described it as a neutral public venue. Monica set the menu flat on the table. The food is pretentious, the portions are embarrassing, and half the people in this room are currently working on something that will negatively affect the other half. I come here for business dinners, because everyone comes here for business dinners, which means it's completely without personal meaning to anyone present. She paused. I do not want to have a personal conversation in a room with no personal meaning. He looked at her for a long moment, at the rain-hemmed dress and the composed posture, and the fact that she'd stepped out of a car in a downpour to hold an umbrella over a stranger's head without being asked. All right, Darnell said. Monica signaled without looking. Thomas appeared. She spoke quietly, a bottle of wine on her account, something expensive enough to function as an apology for the abbreviated stay. And then she was standing, and Darnell was standing, and they were leaving the noir room 12 minutes after she'd arrived. The host held the door. Thomas said something gracious. Nobody asked questions because nobody questioned Monica Reed. Outside, the rain had pulled back slightly. Not stopped, softened. Darnell stood on the wet sidewalk in his damp suit and looked at the woman next to him. Where are we going? You mentioned your daughter likes burgers. Monica was looking down the street, already oriented, already calculating. There's a diner on Pryor. Terry Coleman runs it. Open all night. The burger is extraordinary, and the coffee is genuinely terrible, which is how you know it's real. Darnell studied her profile for a second. The CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, who knew a 24-hour diner by the owner's name and described the coffee's awfulness as a mark of authenticity. He found that more interesting than anything that had happened in the last hour. You've been there? I grew up near there. A long time ago, apparently. She glanced at him. Something in the glance was dry and slightly self-aware. I find I miss it more than I let myself admit. My truck's around the corner. She looked at the truck when they reached it, took in the rust above the rear wheel well, the cracked side mirror held in position by a strip of utility tape, the faded decal on the back window that said Cooper Restorations in letters that had been losing the battle with sunlight for about 9 years. She got in without comment, which told him something. Terry's all-night diner occupied a corner of Pryor Street, with the unpretentious permanence of a building that had decided it was staying and then simply stayed through 40 years of everything the city could throw at it. The sign was yellow and blue and missing the apostrophe in Terry's. Had been missing it for as long as Darnell could remember. The window held a handwritten paper that said Open 24 HRS God willing in block letters, which was both a statement of operating hours and something approaching a theological position. Terry Coleman himself was behind the counter when they walked in, a man in his 50s built like someone who had once been very strong and was now just broad, with a beard that had gone mostly gray and an apron that had seen better aprons. He looked up from the grill. Darnell Cooper. The grin was immediate, genuine, the kind that rearranged a whole face. I thought you fell off the earth, just fell behind on everything else. Darnell moved toward a corner booth, back wall, 2 exits visible, old habit from years of his father saying always sit where you can see the room. 2 of the usual Terry. Add bacon? Done. Terry glanced once at Monica, with the particular expression of a man who had learned not to comment on the company his regulars kept but was definitely filing it away for later. Coffee, please, Darnell said. Absolutely, Monica said, and she meant it with a sincerity that made Darnell think she hadn't had genuinely bad diner coffee in a long time and had been missing it without exactly knowing what she was missing. They slid into the booth. Vinyl. Red. One corner slightly repaired with a strip of close-to-matching tape. The table had a sugar dispenser and a bottle of hot sauce, and a laminated menu that was mostly a formality since the real menu was the 20 items Terry had been making for 4 decades, without changing a single one. Monica looked around the diner, not with the careful neutrality of a woman on unfamiliar social terrain, with something else entirely. Something that took the cracked ceiling tiles and the neon Coca-Cola sign and the smell Coca-Cola sign and the smell of frying onions and placed them somewhere specific and real in her memory. The look of recognition for a place she'd thought she'd grown past and found she hadn't. It's the same, she said, quietly. To herself as much as to him, good places stay the same. Darnell settled back. The booth knew his shape and made room for it. My dad used to bring me here when I was about Zoe's age. Said Terry made the only honest cup of coffee in Atlanta, meaning it wasn't trying to be anything other than coffee. That's a high compliment from a mechanic. My dad was pretty specific about authenticity. He paused. In cars. In people. In coffee. The burgers arrived before the conversation could organize itself into small talk, which was fortunate, because Darnell had the sense that small talk was something they'd both expended considerable energy on in their lives, and neither of them had much patience for it right now. Terry set the plates down without ceremony. 2 burgers, built with the architectural seriousness of a man who believed a burger was a matter of craft. Mountain of fries. Something alongside that smelled like garlic butter and was going to be better than it had any right to be. Monica looked at her plate for 1 second, then she picked it up with both hands and bit into it like a person who had been hungry for exactly this thing without knowing it. Her eyes closed briefly. When she opened them, there was something in her face that Darnell recognized, because he saw it sometimes in the shop. The look of a mechanism working exactly as it was designed to work. Pure function. No performance. Oh, she said, 1 syllable carrying genuine weight. Yeah, Darnell reached for his own. Terry's been doing this 40 years. He's not going to stop. This is what I should have been eating for the last 6 months instead of. She stopped herself, took another bite. Decided the rest of the sentence was less important than the burger, which was a decision Darnell respected completely. They ate for a while without talking. The diner sound, the low radio, the grill, the distant bell when the door opened and closed, filled the space between them without pressure. Terry appeared once to top off the coffee, looked at Monica with the specific expression of a man revising an initial estimate upward, and disappeared back behind the counter. The coffee arrived. Darnell watched Monica pick up the cup, watched her take a sip, watched her expression acknowledge, without complaint, that the coffee was exactly as bad as she'd hoped. It's terrible, she confirmed. Told you. It's wonderful. She set it down and looked at it with something that resembled genuine affection. I've been drinking coffee out of a machine in my office that costs $4,200 and produces something that tastes like it's been engineered to offend no one. This tastes like someone made it. Someone did. She looked up at him. The CEO posture had been shifting since the truck. Not gone. It was structural now. He'd been right about that. But something around it had gradually stopped trying. What was left was a woman in a rain-hemmed dress in a red vinyl booth, eating a burger and drinking terrible coffee, and looking less like she was managing something, and more like she'd stopped needing to for a few minutes. He found it more disarming than anything that had happened on the dark road. "Tell me about Zoe," she said it directly. Because he was beginning to understand, direct as a working principle, rather than a personality quirk. She'd learned that directness got you further than indirection, and had never found a reason to change. And so he told her about Zoe, about the Lego, the serious, methodical Lego that always started with the instructions, and then abandoned them about 20 minutes in when Zoe's own ideas turned out to be more interesting. About the way she'd explained to him once, at considerable length, why the wheel arch on a toy car was dimensionally wrong relative to the wheelbase, with a 7-year-old's complete conviction that this was useful information he needed to have. About the morning she'd taken apart the kitchen timer to see what made it work, and then, which was the important part, Darnell told Monica. Successfully put it back together and said it accurately, which he'd chosen to count as net positive. Monica listened. He noticed she listened the way she drove, full attention on what was in front of her. No part of her, somewhere else. "She sounds like she understands things," Monica said. "She doesn't know yet that some things you're not supposed to take apart." He turned his coffee cup. "I'm not in any hurry to teach her that." A quiet fell. Comfortable. The kind that didn't require filling. Then Monica set down her cup and looked at him with the directness she seemed to reserve for things that actually mattered. "Why keep fighting for the shop? You could take a position somewhere. Corporate fleet management, dealership service, something stable. You're clearly good enough. More than good enough, based on tonight. Why the shop?" It was the real question, the one underneath the polite version of itself. Not how's business, but why does it matter to you this much when it's clearly costing you this much? He appreciated that she'd asked it directly instead of circling around to it sideways. "Because my father built it with his hands," Darnell said. "From nothing. He came to Atlanta in '84 with tools and a goal and nothing else, and he spent 23 years building something that was his, that had his name on it. And when I took it over, I took over the name too." He looked at his hands. Still faintly marked despite the silk handkerchief, despite the rain, the permanent watermark of the work. "I'm not going to be the one who folds it up because a bank decided the number doesn't work anymore. I'm not going to explain to Zoe that we quit." He stopped. "She already knows what the sign says. She knows it says Cooper. That means something to her. It means something to me." Monica was quiet for a moment. "It's not foolishness," she said. "Not reassurance. A straight observation. My grandfather built Reed Capital from a single property management office in 1971. He had this phrase he used when things were difficult, which they frequently were, because building something real in this city has never been easy, and he knew that going in. He'd say, "The machine doesn't run on intention. It runs on maintenance." She turned her cup slowly. He meant stay in the work, keep your hands on it. Don't wait for conditions to improve before you do the next necessary thing. "The machine doesn't run on intention," Darnell said. Turned it over. Felt the weight of it. He's right. He was right about most things. Something moved in her voice. Not sentiment exactly, but something that had been organized carefully and still carried weight despite the organization. "He died 4 years ago. I've been running the company for 6 years. The first 2 with him watching, which was easier. The last 4, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The last 4 you've been the one who has to know," Darnell said. She looked at him. "Yeah," she said. 1 syllable. Same weight as the one about the burger, but entirely different freight. Outside Atlanta moved around them, indifferent, wet, alive with its own business. Inside Terry's, the grill hissed. and the radio murmured something with a slow tempo that suited the hour, and no one asked them if they needed anything. Because Terry asked them if they needed anything, had been reading booths for 4 decades, and understood when people were in the middle of something. They stayed until the coffee was cold, and neither of them refilled it. They stayed until the fries were gone and the burgers were history, and the paper napkins had been used and folded and set aside with the absent tidiness of people too absorbed in the conversation to notice what their hands were doing. 2 in the morning arrived quietly. Darnell drove her back north through a city that had wrung itself dry, the streets gleaming and emptied, traffic lights cycling through their colors for nobody in particular. Monica sat in the passenger seat of the F-150, with her heels off and her feet flat on the floor mat and her head tilted slightly toward the window, watching Atlanta pass with the particular attention of someone seeing a familiar thing freshly. The gate at her property was iron and tall, set in a stone wall, with the kind of lighting that said this is serious without being aggressive about it. Darnell stopped the truck on the private road. Left the engine running. Monica didn't immediately get out. "Thank you," she said, "for the car, for leaving a restaurant where neither of us wanted to be. For the burger. Terry deserves the credit for the burger. You knew where to go." She turned to look at him. Something in her face was different from the restaurant, from the road, from the diner. More open. Not vulnerable exactly. Monica Reed did not appear to do vulnerable as a general practice, but present in a way she may have been choosing rather than performing. "I'd like to know how the shop is doing, actually. Not small talk. Actually," he looked at her for a moment. "I'd like to tell you," he said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with $47,000, or the bank letter, or any of the practical weight he'd been carrying since well before tonight. Sitting in the truck with the engine running and rain-cleaned Atlanta quiet outside, it was just true. "Then call me." She pulled a card from somewhere in the dress. The interior architecture of expensive clothing remained mysterious to him, and held it out. Simple. Name and number. No title. That one. He took it. Held it the same careful way he'd held the silk handkerchief. Like something that had been offered with more care than it appeared to cost. She got out. Walked toward the gate. Stopped once, without turning back. "Your father built something worth keeping, Darnell. People who understand that are rare." She went inside. He sat for a moment in the idling truck. Rain gone, city quiet, the card in his hand and a thought forming that he didn't quite have language for yet. Something about the woman on the dark road who'd held an umbrella without being asked. And the woman in the diner who'd listened without performing it, and how they were the same woman, and how the initials on the handkerchief had been right there the whole time. M.R. Monica Reed. He'd filed it away without knowing why. Now he knew why. He drove home, past the West End exit, past the sign he could see from the highway if he looked at the right moment. Cooper Restorations. Est. 1987. Dark at this hour. Waiting for 6 a.m. the way it always waited. He drove home thinking that the suit wasn't cursed after all. Maybe it had just been waiting for the right night. 3 days. That was how long Darnell Cooper did not call. Not because he lost the card. The card was in the breast pocket of the charcoal suit, which was hanging on the back of his bedroom door where he'd put it Saturday night, and hadn't moved since. He knew exactly where it was. He thought about it the way you think about a thing you've decided not touch yet. Aware of its location at all times, in the specific way of a man exercising a choice rather than forgetting he had one. He worked. That was what he did when the thinking got loud. He worked. Monday morning, he was under a '68 Pontiac GTO that needed a complete brake line replacement, and he stayed under it longer than necessary because the undercarriage of a 60-year-old muscle car was a problem with a definite solution, which was more than he could say for most of the other things currently occupying his mind. Tuesday, he rebuilt a carburetor for a client's '71 Chevelle, hands moving through the process with the automatic confidence of someone who had done this particular thing so many times that his fingers knew the sequence before his brain decided to join in. Wednesday, he replaced a cracked head gasket on a '64 Ford Galaxy, which took 11 hours and required the kind of concentration that left no room for anything else, which was the point. Zoe was at school from 8 to 3, and then at Lorraine's until Darnell closed the shop each evening. This had been the arrangement for 2 years. Lorraine lived 7 minutes from the school, and 15 from the shop, and had informed Darnell, at the beginning of this arrangement, that she was not a babysitter and Zoe was not a baby, which was her way of saying she would be there every single day without fail, because that was the kind of woman Lorraine Mitchell was. The kind who showed up and then immediately told you not to make a big deal about the fact that she was showing up. Wednesday evening, picking Zoe up, his sister intercepted him at the door before he could get inside. "Well, I need to get Zoe's backpack, Darnell." "Well?" He looked at Lorraine. She was wearing her teacher look, the one that had survived 20 years of third graders, trying to deflect accountability, and had become essentially impervious to the same tactic from adults. It was fine, fine. Lorraine repeated the word the way you repeat a word that doesn't mean what the speaker thinks it means. You went to the Noir room, and you had a blind date with the CEO of Reed Capital Group, and you're telling me it was fine. He stopped. "How do you know who she is?" "Stephanie Harris is in my book club." Lorraine folded her arms. "I have known exactly who Monica Reed is since I set this up. I just didn't tell you because you would have run in the opposite direction at a speed that would have surprised us both." Darnell stared at his sister for a long moment. "You are genuinely something else, Lorraine. I know." She didn't move. "Fine," you said. "What does fine mean?" "It means we talked. We left the restaurant. We had burgers at Terry's. I drove her home." He paused. "We talked for a long time." Lorraine watched his face with the attention of a woman who had been reading this particular face since it was 3 years old. "And you haven't called her?" "No, because—" He looked past her at the living room where he could hear Zoe arguing cheerfully with a television program about something. The ordinary sound of his ordinary evening, the sound of the life he'd built on the other side of the life that had fallen apart. "Because she runs a company that owns parts of this city. Because I've got a shop that's 2 weeks from foreclosure and $60 in discretionary income and a suit I borrowed energy from a dead man to wear." He said it without heat. Just the facts as they stacked up. Because there's a distance between what was real on Saturday night and what's real on a Wednesday afternoon. And I'm not going to call her up because I like talking to her and pretend the distance isn't there. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. Quiet enough that Darnell paid attention, because Lorraine Mitchell being quiet was unusual in the same way that a car running silent was unusual. It either meant everything was fine or something was very wrong, and you didn't assume which without checking. "You know what your father used to say about the cars? Nobody else would touch." She said it carefully, like she was setting something down on a surface rather than throwing it at him. "Lorraine," he said, "the reason other shops gave up on them wasn't that the cars were unfixable. It was that fixing them required more patience than most people were willing to spend on something that looked like a lost cause from the outside." She held his gaze. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just noting that you have never once looked at a difficult thing and decided it was too complicated to try." He got Zoe's backpack. He strapped his daughter into the truck's passenger seat and drove home through the West End with the windows cracked, and Atlanta's evening settling around them. And Zoe talked about something that had happened at school, involving a disagreement about the correct way to sort colored pencils, which was clearly a matter of significant principle to everyone involved. He listened. He nodded in the right places. He pulled into the driveway of the house he rented 2 blocks from the shop. Small, green trim, the kind of house that didn't draw attention. And he made dinner, and he helped with homework, and he read to Zoe for 20 minutes before she fell asleep, with the profound efficiency of a child who had genuinely exhausted herself. He sat in the kitchen afterward. The bank letter was on the table. He'd opened it Monday morning before the Pontiac. It said what he knew it would say. $47,320. 14 days to resolution or foreclosure proceedings would begin. They'd used the word resolution because they were a bank, and banks preferred language that sounded like problem solving, while meaning the end of something. He didn't touch it. He looked at it from across the table, the way you look at a thing you've accepted without liking. He had 2 weeks. He had a GTO that was almost done. $900 in labor when it was. He had the Galaxy. $1,400. He had 3 other cars in various stages that wouldn't be ready for another month. He had a parts supplier who was owed $6,000 that he'd been managing with careful timing and increasingly creative conversation. He had, in total, a situation that added up to approximately what it had always added up to. Not enough. Not quite enough. The specific mathematics of a business that worked, that genuinely worked, that was good at what it did, that had loyal customers who trusted it, but that had never managed to accumulate the kind of cushion that absorbed shocks like a vindictive ex-wife and a custody battle and 3 years of legal bills. He went to bed. Thursday morning started like most Thursday mornings. Zoe out the door at 7:50. Darnell at the shop by 8. Coffee from the battered percolator in the break room that was technically a corner of the main bay, with a folding table and 2 chairs. The coffee was not good. It had never been good. It was coffee as fuel rather than coffee as experience, which was a philosophy his father had held and passed down along with the tools and the sign and the 40-year-old percolator itself. He was cleaning a distributor cap. Different car, different problem. Same principle. When he heard tires on gravel, not unusual. Cars came in all morning. He didn't look up, then he heard the engine. He looked up. The 1969 Jaguar E-Type in British racing green pulled into the bay entrance and stopped with the composed authority of a car that knew it was being watched and had made its peace with that condition a long time ago. The engine cut. The door opened. Monica Reed stepped out, not the Noir Room version, not the Rain Highway version. This version was jeans, fitted, dark, the kind that cost more than jeans but didn't announce it, and a white shirt and a leather jacket, the color of old saddle leather that had been worn enough to stop being stiff. No heels. Flat boots, hair back. She looked like a woman who had made a deliberate decision about what she was walking into, and dressed for it honestly rather than strategically. Zoe was on her stool in the corner. Thursday was a school holiday, teacher training day, which meant Zoe came to the shop and occupied herself with Lago and the focused observation of everything that happened around her. She looked up from the construction in her lap and assessed the Jaguar with the attention she gave to anything mechanical. "That's a really good car," Zoe said. Informational, unprompted. Monica crouched down to Zoe's level with the ease of a woman who had done this before. Not performing the correct child-appropriate demeanor, just going down to where the 7-year-old was and speaking from there. "Do you think so? The shape is correct." Zoe turned back to her Lego with the brevity of someone who had delivered her verdict and considered the matter closed. Monica stood, looked at Darnell. He had set down the distributor cap and the rag and was standing 4 feet away with motor oil on his forearms and the particular expression of a man who had told himself a specific story about not calling and had just had that story walk through his door, wearing flat boots and carrying a leather folder. "You didn't call," she said it without accusation. Pure observation, the way she observed most things. "No, I thought about why." She reached into the leather jacket and produced a folder, clean, professional. The kind that meant something organized and considered was inside. And then I realized the most efficient way to address why was to come here, rather than waiting for a call that had a meaningful chance of not arriving. He looked at the folder. "What is that?" "Reed Capital Group maintains a fleet of 48 company vehicles." She set the folder on his workbench, on the cleared end, not on top of anything. She'd noticed exactly where the clear space was. "Additionally, I have a personal collection of 11 vintage automobiles. The current maintenance contract for both the fleet and the collection expires at the end of this quarter. The provider has been consistently overcharging, consistently under-delivering, and this is the one I find genuinely offensive. They used the wrong grade of oil on my 1968 Alfa Romeo Giulia last spring, and I didn't find out until the engine started running rough 3 months later." Darnell's jaw tightened. Not at her, at the unnamed shop that had put the wrong oil in a Giulia. That was the kind of negligence that happened when people treated beautiful machines as line items rather than individuals. What grade did they use? That's exactly the question I wanted answered. and it took me 2 weeks to get a straight response. She looked at him steadily. You knew what was wrong with the Jaguar before you opened the hood. You diagnosed it by what you observed from the outside before you had access to the engine. I want someone who does that. Not someone who runs a diagnostic program and tells me what the computer says. He picked up the folder. Inside, a detailed summary of the fleet. Makes, models, years. Maintenance history organized by vehicle and issue category. Current flags. The vintage collection on a separate page, and she hadn't been understating it. The Alfa Romeo Giulia, a 63 Corvette Stingray split window, a 67 Mustang Fastback, a 55 Thunderbird, 6 others that made Darnell slow down and read more carefully than he'd intended to, at the back of the folder. Contract terms, 3 years, monthly retainer, an upfront payment listed at the bottom of the last page that he read twice, because the first time he thought he'd misread it. He hadn't misread it. The number was enough to clear the bank debt. Completely. With enough remaining to cover 6 months of operating expenses, the parts supplier, and the hydraulic lift repair he'd been deferring for 4 months. He closed the folder, set it back on the workbench, looked at Monica Reed standing in his shop in her honest clothes with her hands in her hot jacket pocket, and her face doing the thing where it held several things at once without letting any of them tip the balance. Why now? He said it evenly. Why Thursday morning? Because after Saturday night, I went back to my office Sunday and asked Stephanie to pull our current maintenance contract and run a proper vendor comparison for the Atlanta market. Monica's voice was even. Professional, but precise in the way that indicated she had thought this through carefully before walking in. It took her until Wednesday to do it correctly. The comparison identified Cooper Restorations as the strongest qualified option for our needs. The right size, the right specialization, the documented work on vintage European and American classics, a beat. The business case was already there. Saturday night made me look for it sooner than I otherwise would have. He held the folder and the information in it and looked at her. If the business case hadn't been there, he said, if I was just a mechanic with a shop and no connection to anything useful, would you be here? She held his gaze, didn't look away and didn't rush toward an answer. I don't know. Maybe not on Thursday. Maybe not with a folder. A pause. Small. Precise. But I'd have found a reason. Zoe from her stool, without looking up from the Lego. The ship falls apart if you don't build the engine right. Both adults looked at her. Zoe continued assembling, apparently finished with her contribution. Darnell looked back at Monica. Something in his chest did a thing he recognized as a decision forming. Not made yet, but forming, which with him meant it was most of the way there. He picked the folder back up. I need to read the contract terms carefully, of course, and I need the Alfa Romeo's full service history before I'll touch it. I'll have Stephanie send it today, and I'm going to have a lawyer look at the agreement before I sign anything. Monica looked at him with an expression that was the closest thing to affectionate he'd seen from her yet, which on her face was still considerably more contained than most people's affection, but was absolutely unmistakably present. Darnell, I run a $3 billion company. I am professionally incapable of entering arrangements that aren't documented correctly. I have an entire legal department whose purpose is to ensure that everything is exactly what it says it is. All right. He opened the folder again, looked at the retainer number one more time. Let it be real. I'll read it tonight. There's one more thing. She didn't reach for anything else. Just said it directly. Victor Bryant. The air in the shop shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but the way the air in an engine bay shifts when you find the thing that's actually wrong versus the thing that looked wrong. He looked up from the folder. You know the name, Monica said. It wasn't a question. I know you mentioned someone by that name at the diner. Said he lost a bid. I didn't think much of it at the time. Stephanie monitors property filings in our investment zones as standard practice. We need to know what's moving in areas where we hold assets or are considering acquisition. Monica's voice had shifted into the precise register she used when real information was being transferred. She flagged a pattern 8 months ago. Someone was quietly acquiring parcels across West End. Multiple transactions, different entity names, but the same beneficial owner tracing back through the structure. Victor Bryant. Through a shell company he calls Whitmore Capital. Bryant Development is his main company. Whitmore Capital is how he moves without announcing himself. Darnell, set the folder down. Your shop sits at a corner intersection that gives Bryant street frontage, on two sides of his projected development block, Monica continued. Without that corner, his project loses its anchor. Which is why his offer came with a 48-hour window. He needs you to decide before you have time to understand what that land is actually worth to him. How long have you known my shop was in the analysis? Stephanie's report has had Cooper restorations flagged for 6 weeks. As a data point in a property market analysis, not connected to anything else, a beat. I made the connection Sunday morning when I was going over her files and saw the address. That's when I asked her to run the vendor comparison. He was quiet for a moment, working through the sequence, the timeline, the cause and effect of it. So Bryant made me an offer the day after he saw us at the Noir room. Yes, he saw an opportunity to move faster than he'd planned, because he assumed Saturday night meant you'd be reluctant to appear aligned with Reed Capital's interests. She held his gaze, without flinching. He was trying to get you to sell before you understood the situation. And I want you to understand the situation completely, because you deserve the full informations, regardless of what you decide to do with the contract. He stood in the middle of his father's shop and turned the full information over in his hands the way he turned a problem component, feeling for where the friction was, where the real damage sat, what was actually broken versus what just looked broken. The door at the back of the shop opened. Zoe appeared around the corner of the Pontiac with a section of Lego in each hand, looking between the two adults with the calibrated attention of a child who had detected a shift in the room's atmosphere and was gathering data before deciding what to do with it. Is something wrong? She asked. No, baby. Darnell's voice changed when he spoke to Zoe. Not softer exactly, more settled, like a frequency that had found its right channel. Go finish the engine section. I'll come look in a few minutes. Zoe assessed this, looked at Monica. Are you staying? Monica looked at Darnell. He nodded once. Slight, Monica looked back at Zoe. For a little while, Zoe returned to her stool with the satisfied efficiency of a child whose question had been answered to adequate specification. Victor Bryant's attorney arrived at Cooper Restorations at 2 in the afternoon. Not Bryant himself. Bryant sent a man named Prescott. Gray suit, brown briefcase. The practiced blandness of someone whose job required him to deliver unwelcome news in rooms where the reception was going to be complicated, and who had trained himself to be unaffected by that. He drove a black Audi and parked it with the precision of someone who billed by the hour and had made a habit of not wasting motion. Bryant's office had called ahead. Professional courtesy, the assistant had said, which was a phrase that in this context meant we'd like to control the environment of this conversation before it starts. Monica had gone. She'd spent an hour at the shop, not making conversation, not standing over him while he worked, but present in the particular way of a person who has decided to be somewhere and is entirely comfortable in that decision. She'd sat on the stool next to Zoe's and looked at the Lego construction in progress with genuine interest, and the two of them had eventually gotten into a specific discussion about load-bearing structures that Darnell found unexpectedly absorbing to overhear while he worked on the Pontiac's brake lines. When she left, she'd said Stephanie would send the Alpha's service history by end of day, and she'd looked at him once more at the door with the expression that had been developing all morning, the one that was still professionally composed and also, unmistakably, something else underneath. He'd read the contract twice before Prescott arrived. The terms were exactly what she'd said. Clear. Specific. The upfront retainer confirmed on paper. He'd called his accountant, a woman named Angela Young, who handled the books for 4 West End small businesses, and who possessed the extremely specific professional skill of remaining emotionally neutral in the face of financial information that would destabilize a less experienced person. It's a real contract, Angela had said, after he'd read her the key terms over the phone. Darnell, that retainer clears everything. Everything and then some, I know. You're telling me this to hear me confirm it, or you're telling me this because you're about to talk yourself out of it. He hadn't answered that. He'd thanked her and ended the call. Now Prescott sat across from him in the shop's office, a room that was mostly a desk and 2 chairs and a filing cabinet, and the framed photograph of James Cooper shaking hands with a man outside this same building in 1987, the year the sign went up. Prescott had placed his briefcase on his knee and removed from it a document formatted with the clean typography of something prepared by people who did this regularly. Purchase agreement. Victor Bryant, through Whitmore Capital. Offering $380,000 for the property, building, equipment, and trade name of Cooper Restorations, 48 hours to execute. Darnell read it. With the same attention he'd brought to Monica's contract, he didn't rush. Prescott sat across from him with the professional patience of a man who was paid to wait and had learned not to fill silence unnecessarily. The property was worth more. He knew that. He'd known it for 2 years as the neighborhood shifted around him. New development coming in from the north. Property values climbing in patterns he'd watched without fully engaging with, because engaging with it meant thinking about a future in which the shop was a number on a ledger, rather than a place where work happened. $380,000 for land that was currently assessed at just under $1 million and trending upward. Bryant wanted it fast and below market because, if Darnell understood what he actually held, the conversation changed entirely. He set the document down. "Tell Mr. Bryant I'll need more time to consider." Prescott's expression didn't move. "The 48-hour window is firm." Mr. Bryant's development timeline. "I understand the window." Darnell held Prescott's eyes with the same calm he brought to everything in the shop. Patient, exact, not particularly interested in being managed. "I said I'll need more time. If Mr. Bryant's timeline can't accommodate that, then Mr. Bryant should proceed without this property." "A beat, Mr. Cooper. I think we're done for now." Darnell stood, not hostile, not performing toughness, simply a man who had spent 15 years in his father's shop, dealing with suppliers and customers and bankers, and a custody judge, and had long ago learned that the person who treats someone else's urgency as a fixed constraint has already surrendered the most useful thing in a negotiation. "I appreciate you coming in." Prescott packed up his briefcase with the controlled movement of a man recalibrating. He left. The Audi reversed out of the bay entrance and disappeared into the afternoon. Darnell stood in the middle of the shop for a moment. The Pontiac, the Galaxy, the distributor cap still sitting on the workbench from this morning. Different car, different problem, same principle. The smell of the place, particular, layered, entirely his, that he'd grown up breathing, and couldn't fully separate from the memory of his father in the way that some sensory things fused with people, and stayed fused long after the people were gone. Zoe appeared from behind the Pontiac. She'd heard everything. He'd known she would. "Was that man trying to buy our shop?" "Our shop." He looked at her. "Yeah, he was. Are you going to sell it?" Darnell crouched down, eye level. This was important enough to do correctly. "No." Zoe turned this over with the methodical seriousness she brought to structural problems. "Good," she said finally. "Grandpa's name is on the sign?" "Yeah, baby." His voice did the thing it did when he talked to her. The settled thing. "It is." That night was the longest night. The contract from Reed Capital was on the table next to the bank letter. Angela had walked him through the math twice, and both times arrived at the same number with the same conclusion. The retainer resolved the foreclosure with enough left to operate safely for 2 quarters, while the monthly contract income built its own momentum. Mr. David Cole. It was a real solution. It was also a solution that had walked through his door in the form of a woman he'd spent Saturday night talking to until 2 in the morning and hadn't been able to stop thinking about since. Those 2 facts existed in the same space, and he couldn't entirely separate them, no matter how carefully he tried, and he'd been trying. He'd looked up Reed Capital Group properly that afternoon. Not the name, which he'd known in the ambient way you know the names of buildings and roads that have always been part of the skyline. But the details. The scope, $3.2 billion in assets under management, major real estate holdings across 6 states. A technology investment portfolio that had produced 3 significant returns in 4 years. And Monica Reed, CEO since her grandfather's death, who had taken a company that was already substantial and had made it considerably more so, through a combination of financial precision and the kind of decisiveness that came from actually understanding what she was looking at, rather than just managing what others told her about it. He'd also found Victor Bryant, not hard to find. Bryant Development had been in direct competition with Reed Capital on 2 separate acquisitions in the last 3 years, lost both times. A man who lost twice to the same opponent and then moved against someone connected to that opponent within 24 hours of an opportunity presenting itself was a man with a specific kind of wound, the professional kind that had started to feel personal, the kind that came from being outmaneuvered by someone better prepared and knowing it. Darnell wasn't a complication in a business dispute. He was a pressure point, and Bryant had moved on him the day after seeing them together at the Noir Room, which meant either Bryant was watching Monica's movements closely enough to know about a blind date within hours of it happening, which said something about Bryant's character that Darnell found clarifying in a cold way, or someone in Bryant's orbit had been in that restaurant on Saturday night. Either way, he was on the board now. Not because he'd chosen to be, because someone had placed him there. He sat with that for a long time. He thought about what Monica had said when she handed him the folder. I want you to understand the situation completely, because you deserve the full information, regardless of what you decide to do with the contract. She hadn't minimized it or shaped it into something more comfortable or held back the part that complicated her own position. She'd handed him the whole thing and let him hold it, which was unusual. In his experience, people who held significant power held information with the same grip. They gave you what they needed you to have and kept the rest. Monica had given him information that raised a direct question about her own motives. The question he'd asked her, and answered it with "I don't know," which was the most honest possible answer, and also the hardest one to give. He picked up his phone. He thought about Lorraine's voice. You have never once looked at a difficult thing and decided it was too complicated to try. He thought about the folder, the Alfa Romeo Giulia running rough for 3 months because someone had used the wrong oil and hadn't told her directly when she asked. The real version of that story, slightly embarrassing, the version that said I care about this machine and the people handling it didn't, and I've been frustrated about it for months. She hadn't given him the corporate version. She'd given him the actual version. He thought about the question he'd asked and the answer she'd given. I'd have found a reason. He called. It rang twice, Monica's voice, careful at first and then not. Darnell, I'm going to sign the contract. He said it directly because that was the only register that had worked between them since the dark road and there was no reason to change it now. I want to be clear about why. Not because of the foreclosure, not because of Bryant, not because of anything, except that the terms are correct, and I'm the right shop for the job, and my father built this place to do exactly this kind of work. I'm not going to refuse a fair contract because of what it might look like. He paused. That's the professional reason, a beat, clean. Is there a different reason? I'd like to see you again. That's the other reason. Those are 2 separate things, and I'd like to keep them separate. Yes, Monica said. No hedging, no qualifications. Those are separate things. I'd like to keep them that way too. A pause that was not uncomfortable. The kind of pause between people who have said something true and are letting it settle before moving again. I have a meeting at 7 tomorrow morning, Monica said, and another at 9, and approximately 6 more things after that. But Friday evening, there's a place on Cascade that does a smothered pork chop, Darnell said. Nothing fancy. Terry's is my baseline for not fancy, so when I say not fancy. Friday evening, Monica said. And there was something in her voice, fractional, present, unmistakable, once you knew what to listen for. That was the voice of a woman who had spent the day being exactly what her position required, and was now speaking as a person rather than a role. He said goodnight. He sat in the kitchen for a while after, the bank letter and the Reed Capital contract on the table side by side. The photograph of James Cooper on the office wall, which he couldn't see from here but knew exactly where it was. The house around him quiet in the specific way of a house with a sleeping child in it. Not empty, just settled. He didn't feel like a man who'd been rescued. He felt like a man who'd been given a fair fight when a fair fight was what he needed, which was different. Crucially different in a way that mattered to him more than most people would understand, and that he didn't need to explain to anyone to know was true. He was going to call the bank in the morning. Call Angela. Have Jeffrey Lewis, a lawyer who'd done work for the shop twice before, charged reasonable rates, and didn't make you feel like the process was designed to make you feel small, review the contract before he signed. And then he was going to get back to work on the cars that were waiting, and keep the shop running the way it had always been kept running. And Friday evening, he was going to a place on Cascade Avenue that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. He turned off the kitchen light. He went to bed. And for the first time since Saturday, he slept without the specific weight of an unmade decision pressing on his chest. Because the decision was made, and it was the right one. And a man who had spent 15 years making calls about what was broken and what was worth fixing had looked at everything in front of him and trusted his own read. Victor Bryant came in person on Friday, not Prescott, Bryant himself. A man in his late 50s with silver at his temples and the physical bearing of someone who had been powerful long enough that it had changed the way he occupied space. The gravitational assumption of a man who expected rooms to orient themselves around his arrival. He wore a suit that announced its own quality without naming a brand, which was a more considered kind of display, and, in Darnell's experience, a more determined one. He did not call ahead. He arrived at 11 in the morning when Darnell was in the middle of a conversation with Jeffrey Lewis about Contract Clause 3, which related to the scope of emergency service callouts and needed one word changed to protect both parties. Lewis had come to the shop because Darnell preferred in person for legal matters. Too much precision got lost in a phone call when the exact words were what mattered. Lewis had read the contract the previous evening, called Darnell at 8 that morning with his notes, and arrived at 10:30 with a clean copy and a pen. Bryant walked into the shop with the ease of a man who had decided in advance that the space belonged to him. He looked around with the eyes of a man performing evaluation. The Pontiac, the Galaxy, the organized stations of components and tools, the sign above the back wall. He looked at the sign the way a man looks at a thing he has already mentally replaced with something else. Darnell finished his sentence to Lewis, held up one finger, and turned. Mr. Bryant. He said the name the way he said the name of an unfamiliar component, identifying, without affect, without anything extra attached to it. Bryant looked at him with the expression of a man who had pre-decided the tone of this conversation and intended to set it before anyone else could. Expansive. Reasonable. The magnanimous version of himself, which was a costume several sizes too small for what was underneath it. Mr. Cooper. I thought I'd come by in person since my associate wasn't able to move things forward yesterday. I respect a man who wants to look the other party in the eye. I haven't made a decision yet. Darnell held Bryant's gaze with the same steadiness he brought to everything in the shop. Patient, exact, not particularly interested in being redirected. I told Prescott I needed more time. That stands. Bryant's expansiveness adjusted by a degree. Not gone, recalibrated. The window. The window is your timeline, not mine. Same register, same pace. You're offering $380 for property that appraises north of $900. I understand why the window exists. It exists because if I take time, I find that out. He paused one beat. I've taken time. I've found that out. Bryant looked at him for a moment. Recalibrating further. He glanced at Jeffrey Lewis, assessed him, filed him, moved on. Then back to Darnell. I heard you had an interesting evening recently. The shift was deliberate, the move of a man who, finding one approach failing, had prepared another. Monica Reed. You two seem to have gotten acquainted quickly. Darnell held the look without changing it. I also heard, Bryant continued, building the tone of a man sharing unfortunate information out of genuine concern, that her interest in your shop is very recent, very conveniently timed. I've done business in this city for 30 years, Mr. Cooper, and I've watched Monica Reed operate for most of them. She's effective. She's also strategic in ways that aren't always visible from inside a situation. He let that land. gave it space. I'd hate to see a good man mistake a calculated move for something personal. Lewis shifted slightly in his chair. Professional instinct, kept carefully contained. Darnell took a breath. Slow. Let it out the same way. Then he looked at Victor Bryant, with the particular calm of a man who has concluded that the most accurate response to a certain kind of provocation requires the least elevation to deliver. "You know what comes through my door every week?" He said it almost conversationally, the way he'd talk to a customer about a car. Machines that other shops gave up on. Car after car that somebody told the owner was finished. Not worth the time. Too far gone. He glanced at the Pontiac, then back to Bryant. "You can always tell the difference between a machine that's actually done and one that the last person just didn't know how to read. The presentation might look the same, but the actual condition is different, and the difference matters." He paused. "I can read what I'm looking at right now, and what I'm looking at is a man who lost 2 acquisitions to the same person and is trying to use my shop to recover something he lost fair." Bryant's face did something. Not much. Controlled. But something. Lewis had gone entirely still in his chair with the professional immobility of a man who has decided to be furniture until further notice. "I'm not signing your contract," Darnell said. "This shop is not for sale. Not at 380, not at a number that actually reflects what the land is worth, not at any number, because this shop has my father's name on it, and that doesn't have a column in your spreadsheet." He unfolded his arms. "I appreciate you coming in person. I think we're done." Bryant stood still for 3 seconds. The kind of 3 seconds that were not about forming a response, but about managing something that was not going to show on his face if he could prevent it. He turned and left. Not fast, controlled. The exit of a man who had not gotten what he came for, and had enough practice to make the exit look like a choice he'd made, rather than a conclusion someone else had reached for him. The Audi reversed out of the entrance and was gone. Lewis exhaled, looked at Darnell with an expression that was professionally neutral, and also, around the edges, contained something that resembled a verdict reached in private. Should I be concerned about what comes next from that direction? Probably. Darnell picked up the contract from the desk, which is why I'd like to finish talking about Clause 3. Lewis pulled out his pen. The shop was quiet around them, the right kind of quiet. The kind that came from work waiting, and the right decision already sitting where it needed to sit. Outside, Atlanta went about its Friday. The sign above the bay caught the midday light the way it always caught it. Cooper Restorations Est, 1987, each letter exactly as his father had painted them, refreshed twice and never changed. The kind of thing that looked, from the outside, like it had simply always been there. Which was, Darnell thought, not the worst thing in the world to look like. Friday evening came in quietly, no rain this time. The kind of Atlanta evening that arrived in early fall like an apology for the summer, temperature dropping just enough to mean something, the air losing its weight, the city exhaling after months of holding itself tense against the heat. Darnell locked the shop at 6:15, changed out of his work clothes in the small bathroom off the break room, and stood in front of the mirror in a clean shirt and dark jeans, and told himself this was not a complicated situation. It was dinner. It was a place on Cascade he'd been going to since his 20s. It was a woman he'd had an honest conversation with and wanted to have another one. Cybele, except nothing about Monica Reed was simple, and he'd known that since the moment her window lowered 2 inches in the rain, and her voice came through it with the controlled precision of someone who had learned to give nothing away by accident. And the fact that it wasn't simple was not, he was discovering, the problem he'd assumed it would be. He'd been treating complexity as an argument against a thing. He was beginning to understand it might just be a description of the thing itself. Not a warning, just a characteristic, the way an inline-6 had more moving parts than a 4-cylinder, and that was why it sounded the way it sounded. He drove to Cascade. She was already there, not waiting in a car. Standing outside on the sidewalk in the mild evening air, looking at the restaurant's hand-painted window sign with the expression of a woman encountering something that had existed in her memory for a long time and was now confirming its own accuracy. She was wearing dark pants and a burgundy top, and her hair was down in a way it hadn't been any of the previous times, which was a small fact that landed somewhere in his chest with more weight than it had any logical right to carry. She heard the truck. Turned. The expression when she saw him was not the composed professional assessment, not the careful social calibration. It was something that arrived before she could organize it. Quick, unguarded, the expression of a person who is genuinely glad to see a specific other person and hasn't yet had time to decide how much of that to show. It lasted about a second and a half. Then the composure reassembled, but he'd seen it. He filed that one differently from the others. Not away, just differently. You're early, he said, reaching the sidewalk. I'm always early. She said it like stating a law of physics. It's a condition. I've accepted it. I'm usually on time. You're 4 minutes early. She glanced at the door. Which means you plan to be early. Which means we're the same in at least one way. That'll do for now, Darnell said, and opened the door. The place on Cascade was called Beaumont's, and it had been on that corner for 31 years under 3 different owners, all of whom had had the wisdom to leave the menu essentially unchanged because some things achieve a kind of institutional perfection that tampering with constitutes a civic offense. The current owner was a woman named Pamela Scott, who had bought it from the previous owner's estate 6 years ago and run it with the particular energy of someone who understood that a neighborhood restaurant's greatest asset was its own unbroken continuity. The booths were wood. The tables had paper placemats with Atlanta landmarks printed on them in blue ink. The smothered pork chop had been the same smothered pork chop since 1993, and there was no reason to believe it would ever be anything different. Pamela appeared from the back with the trajectory of a woman who had a sense of who was in her restaurant at any given moment and moved accordingly. She looked at Darnell, looked at Monica, and had the grace to express nothing beyond a very slight recalibration of the warmth she was already projecting. Darnell, haven't seen you in a few weeks. Been busy, he gestured. This is Monica. Pamela looked at Monica with the level gaze of a woman who had been running a neighborhood institution long enough to have seen every variety of person sit in her booths and had learned to read them without performance. Monica met the look directly and without the managed quality she'd carried at the Noir Room, and something in Pamela's assessment appeared to resolve in a favorable direction. Corner booth okay? Perfect, Monica said. They ordered without looking at the menus for long, because the menus were not complicated, and the decision was obvious. Smothered pork chop, butter beans, cornbread that arrived in a cast-iron skillet and had no business being as good as it was. Monica tasted the cornbread first, broke off a piece with her hands because there was no other correct way to address cornbread that arrived in a cast-iron skillet. And the fact that she understood this without hesitation was another entry in the file he'd been building. She chewed, looked at the piece in her hand, looked at Darnell. Why have I been eating catered lunches for 6 years when this exists 12 minutes from my office? Because your office is in Midtown and you don't take lunch. She looked at him. How do you know I don't take lunch? Because you sent me contract revisions at 12:47 on Thursday, and at 1:18, and again at 1:52. He reached for the butter beans. People who take lunch don't send contract revisions at 12:47. A pause. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. That's a more careful observation than I expected. I notice things, he said it simply. Professional habit. You read an engine by what it does when you're not asking it to do anything specific. The idle tells you more than the full throttle. Monica considered this. Tore another piece of cornbread. What does my idle tell you? That you've been running at full throttle so long, you've forgotten what idle feels like. He held her gaze. And that you're better at this, he gestured at the restaurant, the food, the corner booth, the paper placemat with its blue ink landmarks, than you think you are. You just don't do it enough for it to feel natural yet. She was quiet for a moment. Not the composed quiet of someone managing a reaction. The actual quiet of someone receiving information and letting it land where it needed to. My grandfather used to eat at places like this every Sunday. She looked at the placemat. He said it was mandatory. He said, If you spent the whole week in rooms full of people who needed something from you, Sunday lunch somewhere, nobody knew your name was how you remembered what you were actually for. A pause. After he died, I stopped doing it. I told myself I didn't have time. I think the real reason was that I didn't want to do it without him. Darnell didn't fill the silence. He'd learned early, from his father, from years of working on machines that communicated in vibration and sound rather than language, that some silences were full rather than empty, and the correct response to a full silence was not to empty it. 6 years is a long time to skip Sunday lunch, he said finally. It is. She looked up. Something in her face was open in the particular way of a person who has said a true thing to someone they weren't planning to say it to and has found, unexpectedly, that this was the right person to say it to. I'm working on it. The pork chop arrived, and then they were quiet in the good way, occupied, present, two people comfortable enough with each other that eating together didn't require constant maintenance. The restaurant moved around them. The restaurant moved around them. Pamela appeared twice, once to check, once to refill, and each time she had the instinct not to linger, which was one of the great gifts a good restaurateur gave her. Guests. They talked through dinner and after, into coffee that was considerably better than Terry Coleman's, which Darnell mentioned, and Monica said Terry's coffee was not meant to be good, and therefore couldn't be improved upon, which was a philosophical position he found both incorrect and oddly compelling. They talked about the Alfa Romeo's service history, which Stephanie had sent, and which Darnell had read twice, because it was distressing in the specific way that evidence of sustained negligence was always distressing. They talked about Zoe's Lego project, which had evolved from a spaceship into what Zoe was now describing as a mobile repair station, which was either a sign of hereditary influence or independent convergence. Monica laughed at that, the real laugh, the one that arrived before she managed it, and said it sounded like Zoe had found her thing. She has, Darnell said, and the way he said it was not the proud parent performance. It was the quiet certainty of a man who had watched a small person discover the shape of themselves and recognize the shape as genuine. She doesn't know yet how rare that is. Finding your thing at 7. I didn't find mine until I was 26. Monica turned her coffee cup. And I'm still not sure it's the right thing. Being good at something and it being your thing are not always the same. What would your thing be? If it wasn't the company, she thought about it. Genuinely, not as a performance of consideration, but as an actual process of looking at something she didn't look at very often. I used to take things apart when I was Zoe's age. Not engines, appliances, clocks, anything with a mechanism I couldn't see. My mother was not pleased. A slight curve at the corner of her mouth. My grandfather thought it was wonderful. He said anyone who needed to understand how something worked before they'd accept that it did was worth his time. Darnell looked at her. So, you went into finance. I went into finance because my grandfather needed someone to carry it, and I was the one who understood it well enough and loved him enough to say yes. She said it without bitterness. Clearly. That's not a tragedy, but it's not the same as choosing it. She looked at him. You chose it. I did. Every day. You keep choosing it. She said it as an observation rather than a compliment, which made it land considerably harder than a compliment would have. I watch you in the shop and you move like someone who is exactly where they decided to be. There's no part of you somewhere else. You're entirely there. She paused. I spend most of my time in rooms where I'm physically present and mentally managing 3 other conversations simultaneously. I've been doing it long enough that I started to think it was just how I was built. It's not how you're built, Darnell said. It's how you've been running. She looked at him for a long moment. You're going to tell me to slow down. I wouldn't presume to tell you anything. He leaned back. I'm just noting that the Jaguar runs beautifully at 90. She's built for it. But you still have to bring her in at regular intervals or she'll quit on you, on a dark road in the rain, on a night, when the only person who happens to know what they're looking at is already late for somewhere else. He held her gaze. You got lucky once. A beat. Monica held the look with the directness she brought to everything that actually mattered to her. I know, she said. And the register of it was different from her professional acknowledgments. It was the register of a person admitting something to themselves, through the act of saying it to someone else, which was the only way some things got admitted at all. They left Beaumont's at 9:30. Pamela said good night with the warmth of a woman who had reached a private conclusion and was keeping it graciously to herself. Outside, the evening had settled into the particular comfort of an Atlanta night that had stopped trying to be summer. The air mild and honest, the street quiet, in the way of a neighborhood that kept its own hours and didn't apologize for them. Monica's car was parked half a block down. Darnell walked with her. Not because it required discussion. Because they were walking in the same direction and neither of them had moved to end the evening yet. They stopped at the Jaguar. She turned to face him. The streetlight caught the left side of her face and left the rest in shadow, which was not intentional and was entirely effective regardless. "I had a genuinely good time," she said. Directness as a baseline always. "I want you to know that's not a phrase I use generically. I didn't think you did, I also want to say." She paused, chose the words with the care she brought to things that actually mattered. "What I said this week. In the shop, about finding a reason. I meant it without condition. Whatever happens with the contract, whatever Bryant does next. I want you to know that those things are separate from this. Completely separate. And if at any point they start to feel like they aren't, I need you to tell me." He looked at her. "I will, because I'm not." Another pause, shorter, like she was locating something she didn't reach for often. "I'm not practiced at this. The version of this where it's real. I'm practiced at the version where there's a defined parameter and a clear outcome, and everyone understands their role going in. This is different, and I know it's different, and I don't want to default to the practiced version, just because it's more comfortable." Darnell stood on the sidewalk, outside Beaumont's on Cascade Avenue in the mild October evening, and looked at the most strategically capable person he'd encountered in recent memory, telling him, with complete direct, that she was working something out in real time and wanted him to know it. He found it more courageous than anything she'd done in a boardroom. "I'm not practiced at it either," he said. "I was. Once. And then I wasn't, and I've been managing around the absence of it for 2 years." He held her gaze. "This is the first time in 2 years that managing around the absence of it has seemed like the wrong approach. A silence. Not empty. Full of something that didn't have better language than what was already present between them." Monica looked at him for one long moment. Then she stepped in and kissed him, one hand at his jaw, brief and certain and entirely without equivocation. When she stepped back, the expression on her face was the unguarded one, the one from before she'd had time to organize it. He thought that was probably the most valuable thing he'd seen all week. "Sunday," she said. Her voice was in the same register as the coffee cup moment at Terry's, stripped of the professional architecture, just a person speaking. "I'm going to take Sunday." He understood what she meant. "Good," she got in the Jaguar. He waited until the engine turned over. That sound, particular and authoritative, that he now associated with something other than a diagnostic problem, and watched the taillights move south on Cascade before he walked back to his truck. He drove home feeling like a man who had made peace with the complexity of a thing rather than trying to resolve it into something simpler. The complexity was still there. The distance between their worlds was real and wasn't going to be managed away by a good dinner and an honest conversation on a sidewalk. There were going to be days when that distance asserted itself in ways that required real navigation. When her schedule and his schedule existed on different planets. When the weight of her position pulled attention in directions that had nothing to do with a mechanic shop in West End. When the math of 2 very different lives got difficult in ways that a strong foundation could hold and a weak one couldn't. He knew that. He'd known it since the dark road. He just wasn't treating it as a reason anymore. Victor Bryant made his next move on a Tuesday. Not through Prescott. Not in person. Through journalist named Raymond Harris at the Atlanta Business Chronicle, who published on a Tuesday morning an article about Reed Capital Group's Meridian Tower acquisition that contained, embedded in the 4th paragraph, a suggestion that the CEO's personal relationship with a West End contractor had prompted questions among investors about the independence of Reed Capital's procurement decisions. No accusation. Nothing actionable. Just a suggestion. The particular journalistic technique of presenting a question, as if it were a PAC question, as if it were a vid and waiting, as if reasonable people were already asking, and the article was merely reporting that those questions existed. Which was, Darnell understood when Stephanie called him at 8:47 that morning, a considerably more sophisticated instrument than a 48-hour purchase offer, because it operated in a space that was harder to respond to directly. Stephanie had called him, not Monica. He noted that. Stephanie Harris's voice was the voice of a woman who had been professionally unflappable for a long time, and was currently spending a significant portion of her resources being exactly that. I want you to hear this from me directly rather than finding it on your own, which you were going to do within the hour. I've already seen it. Angela had texted him the link at 8:30. He'd read the article in the shop parking lot before going inside, sitting in the truck with the engine off, reading it once, straight through, and then again, with the slower attention, he'd give a contract clause that didn't sit right. What's Monica's position? Monica is handling it. A pause. Careful. She's scheduled a board meeting for this afternoon, and she asked me to call you because she's in back-to-back preparation sessions until noon and she didn't want you to. Another pause. Briefer. She didn't want you to think she was managing you out of the situation. He sat with that for a moment. Monica Reed, in the middle of what was clearly a significant professional problem, had thought to have someone call him so he wouldn't feel sidelined. That went into a different category from the other entries in the file. The category that was about what a person did under pressure, rather than when everything was comfortable. Pressure showed the actual architecture. Hers was what he'd suspected it was. Tell her I'm not going anywhere, he said. Tell her I'll be at the shop. He went in. He worked. The Pontiac was done, finished it Monday, brake response exactly right, the kind of result that justified every hour of the job. And a new car had arrived Tuesday morning, a '69 Camaro that needed framework and a complete electrical rebuild. Big job, good one. He put his full attention on the Camaro, assessed the frame damage methodically, made a list of what the electrical system needed in the order he'd need to address it. He worked through the morning in the particular state that the shop produced in him, everything outside, becoming quiet, while the problem in front of him held all the parts of his mind that were useful. At 12:40, his phone showed a text from Monica. Out of prep. Bored at 3. I'll call after. You okay? He typed back. Working on a '69 Camaro. Frame damage and full electrical rebuild. It's going to be a good job. A pause. Then, that sounds like it. He sent back. It's a yes. Another pause. Longer. Then, thank you for staying in the room. He looked at that for a moment. Set the phone face down on the workbench. Picked up the frame assessment sheet and went back to work. The board meeting was at 3. He didn't know what happened in it in real time. He found out at 6:15 when Monica called, and her voice told him, before she said a single substantive word, that whatever had happened had not gone the way Bryant had intended. I disclosed, she said. The sentence was complete in itself. He waited. I walked into that room, and before anyone could raise the article, I disclosed the personal relationship under our conflict of interest policy. Full disclosure. The contract, the terms, the timeline, the fact that we met before any business discussion began. Her voice had the quality of a person who has done something that cost them something real, and has concluded it was the right cost. I also presented the vendor comparison Stephanie ran last week. The independent analysis that identified Cooper Restorations as the leading qualified option in the Atlanta market for our specific needs. That analysis was completed after I asked Stephanie to run it, which was after Saturday night. The vendor selection stands on its own merits. The timeline is documented. How did the board respond? Mixed at first. 2 members had concerns about optics. 3 others, including our lead independent director, noted that transparent disclosure is precisely the correct governance response to a potential conflict, and that the vendor selection was independently supported by analysis that preceded any formal offer. A pause. The contract stands, with additional oversight provisions that I proposed, which removes the optics issue entirely, because the oversight is now formal, documented, and visible. He straightened against the Camaro's doorframe. You proposed the oversight yourself. It was the right move. Bryant was trying to create ambiguity. The answer to ambiguity is clarity, a beat. I'm not going to let someone else's agenda make me defensive about a decision that was correctly made from the beginning. No, Darnell said. You're not. A silence. The comfortable kind. I'd like to see you this weekend, Monica said. It came out with slightly less of the professional architecture than her previous sentences, which he had learned to read as a signal of what was underneath the words, not for anything specific. I'd just like to be somewhere that isn't a boardroom. Saturday morning, he said. The shop. I'll be working on the Camaro frame. You can watch, or you can help, or you can drink bad coffee. Your call. The sound she made was not quite a laugh. Close to one. I'll bring better coffee. Don't, Darnell said. It ruins the atmosphere. This time it was a laugh. Full and unguarded, the one he'd seen arrive before she could prepare for it. The one that was becoming the thing he most reliably looked forward to. Good night, Darnell. Good night. He locked up the shop. Drove home through the West End in the early evening, the neighborhood doing its ordinary business around him. A group of men outside the barber shop 2 blocks north. The laundromat on the corner with its warm light. The elementary school at the end of the block with student artwork, still visible in the windows from some fall project, bright colors against the dark glass. He thought about what Monica had said. Transparent disclosure is the correct governance response. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't gone after Bryant. She had simply, accurately, completely, without hedging, told the truth in the room where the truth needed to be told, and the truth had been sufficient. And the truth had been sufficient, because she'd built the decision correctly from the beginning. The truth was sufficient. You didn't need a story if you had the actual sequence of events in the right order. The machine doesn't run on intention, Monica's grandfather had said. It runs on maintenance. Darnell was beginning to think that applied to more things than engines. Bryant made one more attempt, a week later, through a contact at the City Planning Commission. Not Prescott, not a journalist, a city official, who had apparently received a contribution from a Bryant-affiliated political action committee, and was willing, in exchange, to raise procedural questions about Cooper Restoration's zoning compliance for its current use classification. It was thin. Jeffrey Lewis identified it as thin within 20 minutes of reviewing the notice. The shop had been in continuous operation under the same use classification since 1987, and had never had a compliance issue, and the procedural question being raised was based on a regulatory interpretation that had been superseded by a 2019 amendment that the official had either not read or was hoping Darnell hadn't read. Darnell had read it. Lewis confirmed it. But dealing with it took 2 days and $240 in legal fees and a formal written response, which was the point. Not to win. Bryant knew he wasn't going to win this one. The point was to cost Darnell time and money and attention, to create friction, to be an ongoing source of small difficulty in the hope that small difficulty accumulated, started to feel like too much trouble. Darnell filed the response, paid Lewis, went back to the Camaro. He told Monica about it on Saturday when she came to the shop, as she'd said she would. And she did bring coffee, despite his instructions, from a place nearby that was considerably better than the Percolator, which he accepted without comment and drank without admitting how much better it was. She sat on the stool next to where Zoe usually sat. Zoe was at Lorraine's that morning. Darnell had texted his sister the night before, when Monica confirmed she was coming, and listened to the zoning situation with the focused attention she gave real information. Her expression moved through a sequence he'd learned to read: assessment, calculation, conclusion. Bryant is trying to make himself expensive, she said. He can't stop the shop, and he can't undo the contract, and he knows both of those things. So he's trying to make your life complicated enough that you start to feel like the complications are costing more than the benefit. I know that's the play. Darnell wiped his hands. It's not a sophisticated play. It doesn't need to be sophisticated. It just needs to be persistent. She turned her coffee cup. I can have our legal team file. No, he said it without heat. Clear, she looked at him. "This is my shop and my fight," he said. "I'm not going to run Bryant's moves through your legal team. That changes what this is. I handle the shop. You handle Reed Capital. Those stay separate." Monica held his gaze for a long moment. He could see her working through it. The instinct of a person who solved problems with whatever resources were available, running up against a position she hadn't anticipated, processing it, arriving somewhere. "All right," she said. Not concession. Agreement with a position she'd evaluated and found sound. "But I'd like your read on the Planning Commission contact, professionally. Whether this is Bryant using that channel for the first time, or whether it's an established pattern. It's a pattern." Her voice moved into the precise register. "He used the same tactic against a mixed-use development project in Vine Cities 3 years ago. Filed a zoning challenge that delayed the project 8 months. The underlying question was dismissed, but the delay achieved what he needed. He didn't expect you to have legal representation already in place. Lewis has been on retainer since before this started. I called him the day after Bryant's attorney first came by." Monica looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not downward, not upward, but laterally, adding a dimension she hadn't fully mapped yet. "You saw this coming before I told you about Bryant. I saw that Bryant doesn't quit." Darnell reached for the Camaro's frame assessment. "I've worked on machines that had one thing wrong, and once you fixed it, they ran fine. I've worked on other machines where the problem was systemic, where every fix revealed another layer because the real issue was deeper than what was presenting. Bryant is the second kind of problem." He looked at her. "You don't resolve the second kind with a single solution. You resolve it by being more patient than it is." Monica was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, "My grandfather would have liked you." He didn't answer that directly. The weight of it was sufficient without a response added to it. She stayed at the shop until noon, well past what the visit required, sitting on the stool and reading something on her phone for a stretch while he worked the Camaro's frame, then setting the phone face down on the floor and asking questions about what he was doing. That were not the polite questions of someone performing interest, but the real questions of someone who wanted to understand the actual process. He answered them fully. She listened the way she always listened. Complete attention, nothing held in reserve for somewhere else. He thought about what she'd said at Beaumont's, about watching him in the shop and noticing that he was entirely there. The thing that had sounded like an observation but was also, he'd realized later, a kind of longing. She wasn't wrong about herself. She'd spent years present in rooms while simultaneously managing everything the rooms required of her. But on the stool in the shop on a Saturday morning, with her coffee going cold on the floor beside her, she was entirely there. She just hadn't noticed yet that she was. He didn't say it. Some things were better encountered than pointed at. 3 months moved differently than he expected, not with visible milestones and obvious turning points. More the way good maintenance worked. Incremental, consistent, the result of regular attention rather than any single intervention. You didn't always see the change while it was happening. You saw it in the aggregate, when you stepped back and compared where you were with where you'd been. The shop was different in the aggregate. 2 new full-time mechanics. Darnell had hired them carefully, over 3 weeks. Interviewing 7 people and choosing the 2 who answered his diagnostic questions with honesty about what they didn't know, rather than performance of what they thought he wanted to hear. A third he'd put on part-time for fleet rotation work, which had its own rhythm and requirements. The Reed Capital fleet cars came in on a schedule that Stephanie had organized with the specific efficiency of a woman who had been coordinating a CEO's logistics for 8 years and had the scheduling instincts of someone accustomed to making complicated things look straightforward. The vintage collection was the work he kept for himself. The Alfa Romeo Giulia had taken 3 weeks to bring right. He'd documented everything, photographed each component before and after, kept a written record of every finding and the reasoning behind each one. When he sent Monica the completed assessment with the full documentation attached, her response came back in 11 minutes. 11 minutes was faster than she typically responded to anything that wasn't urgent. The message said, This is exactly what I needed. Thank you. He'd added it to the file. Different category from the others. Bryant went quiet after the planning commission attempt failed. Not permanently. Darnell didn't believe in permanent quiet from that particular source, but durably quiet. Long enough to establish a new operational baseline. Lewis checked in monthly, with a report on any new filings or property activity in the relevant area, and for 3 months the report came back clean. Darnell paid Lewis for the clean reports with the same regularity he'd have paid for the busy ones, because that was how you kept good counsel. You paid them when the problem wasn't visible too, because that was often when the work mattered most. Lorraine had opinions about Monica. She delivered them over the phone in installments, like a series with a through-line argument and multiple supporting pieces of evidence. The through-line was that Darnell had finally done the thing she'd been trying to get him to do for 2 years, which was encounter another person as a full human being, rather than a risk to be carefully managed. The supporting evidence included various observations from the 2 occasions she'd met Monica briefly. Once when Monica had dropped something off at the shop, and Lorraine happened to be there picking up Zoe, and once at a Sunday dinner at Darnell's house, where Monica had arrived with very good bread from a bakery she knew and had spent 40 minutes at the kitchen table talking to Zoe about load-bearing structures and the engineering principles of suspension bridges. After that Sunday dinner, Lorraine had pulled Darnell into the kitchen under the pretext of checking something that didn't need checking and had said, very quietly, with the specific weight of a woman who had been worried about her brother for 2 years and was now experiencing significant relief, "She sees you. Not the mechanic. Not the shop that's been struggling. Not the single dad making it work. You. She sees the actual you." He hadn't argued with her, because Lorraine was right. And he'd known it for a while, and hadn't said it, because saying it made it real, in a way that required him to also acknowledge how long it had been since someone had done that. Monica saw the shop the way he saw it. Not its financial situation, not its real estate value, not its symbolic weight as his father's legacy in the abstract, but the work itself, what it produced, what it required of the person doing it, what it meant that he did it the way he did it. She'd seen it from the moment she held the umbrella over the open engine bay in the rain. And she'd kept seeing it every Saturday morning since, and he understood now that the seeing had been there before she'd had any practical reason for it. Some things you recognized in retrospect. You were in the middle of it and you didn't know what it was, and then time passed. And you looked back at the sequence of events, and you could see the shape of the thing that had been forming while you were only aware of its individual components, the MR. On the handkerchief, the way she'd stepped out of the car without being asked. The word tired said with the specificity of someone naming their own experience. The umbrella held steady over the engine while rain hammered everything else. All of it had been the same thing. He just hadn't known what to call it yet. The Saturday in November that mattered most didn't announce itself when it started. Overcast morning. Darnell at the shop by 7:30 for the Camaro. The framework was done, and the electrical rebuild was in its final stage. And he wanted to test the ignition sequence before the client came in Monday for the reveal, which was the moment he liked best in this work. The client's face when a car they'd brought in looking like a problem drove out looking like itself again. He had the ignition wiring laid out on the bench in the sequence he'd established, and he was moving through it with the methodical attention it required, which meant his phone was face down, and the radio was on something soft, and the rest of the world was on a brief voluntary hold. Monica arrived at 9, not because they'd specifically arranged 9, because 9 was, he'd come to understand, the time she arrived when she was coming on a Saturday without a particular agenda, when she came because she wanted to be there, and 9 was simply when she arrived. And the pattern of it was something he'd stopped analyzing and started recognizing as a feature of how things were between them now. She had coffee. Good coffee, he'd stopped objecting. She settled onto her stool with the ease of someone in familiar territory. The leather jacket, dark jeans, the way she sat, straight but not rigid, the posture of someone who carried authority in her spine but had learned, in this particular room, to let some of it rest without losing any of it. They worked in parallel for an hour. Her on her phone. He could hear from the cadence of her responses that it was something real, something requiring actual thought rather than routine approval. Him on the Camaro's ignition wiring, the radio between them. The smell of the shop, the sound of the street outside changing quality as the morning advanced, and the neighborhood woke up around them. Zoe arrived at 10. Lorraine dropped her at the shop on Saturday mornings when Monica was there. Darnell had gotten into the habit of texting his sister the night before, and Lorraine had gotten into the habit of reading the text and saying nothing about it, and simply appearing at 10 with Zoe and leaving promptly, which was Lorraine's version of approval rendered without commentary. Zoe came in with her backpack and her current Lego project, and went immediately to her stool and resumed where she'd left off with the focused momentum of a 7-year-old who had found her thing and was somewhere in the middle of following it to its conclusion. For a while, all three of them occupied the shop in their own directions. Then Zoe looked up. She looked at Monica. She looked at Darnell. She processed something, visibly, in the way children processed things when they'd decided something was worth the energy of deciding it properly. "Monica," she said, "do you like being here?" Monica looked at Zoe, set her phone down completely, not face down, just set it aside. "Yes, like actually here. Not just visiting here." A pause. The kind adults gave to questions from children that were better questions than the child knew they were asking. "Actually here," Monica said. "Yeah, this is one of the places I like being most." Zoe turned this over. "Because of my dad?" Monica's expression moved. The unguarded version, present for a full 2 seconds before the composure reassembled. She glanced at Darnell. He kept his face neutral and his attention on the Camaro wiring, and allowed his daughter to continue this line of inquiry without assistance. "Because of your dad," Monica said, "and because of you, and because this shop is a place where things that were broken come back to working." She paused. "I find I need to be around that." Zoe appeared satisfied by this answer. She returned to the Lego with the efficiency of someone who had gathered the information she needed and could now proceed. Darnell connected the last wire in the ignition sequence. Checked the connections once, then again, because once was habit, and twice was professional. Stepped back from the bench, he looked at his daughter on her stool. 7 years old, already understanding what she liked and why she liked it, already building things she'd designed herself, because the blueprint in the box had turned out to be someone else's idea of what it should be. He looked at Monica Reed, CEO of a company that managed $3 billion, sitting on a wooden stool in a West End mechanics shop on a Saturday morning with her jacket on and her good coffee going cold on the floor beside her, because she'd gotten absorbed in whatever she was working on and forgotten it was there. He crossed the shop to where she was sitting. She looked up from her phone. The expression she had when she looked up at him. He'd stopped filing it. He knew what it was. He stood in front of her, and she tilted her chin up and looked at him with the directness she brought to everything that mattered. "What?" she said. "Not suspicious. Curious? Nothing," he said it honestly. "Just, this is a good shop." Monica looked around. The Camaro on the lift. The workbenches with their organized tools, laid out in the sequences his father had established and that he'd maintained not out of sentiment, but because they were good sequences, efficient, logical, the result of a man who'd thought carefully about how work should flow and had gotten it right. "The sign on the back wall, it's a very good shop," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The small, unremarkable gesture of a person who has stopped treating someone else as a proposition to be evaluated, and has simply become accustomed to their presence in the most ordinary possible way. She leaned into it slightly, Zoe, from across the shop, without looking up from the Lego. "Are you two going to be weird about each other now?" Darnell looked at his daughter. "Probably. Okay." She snapped a piece into place with the satisfaction of someone whose structural calculation had proven correct. "Just don't do it while I'm trying to build." Monica laughed. The real one. The one that still, 3 months in, arrived before she had the chance to organize it, and that he had come to think of as the truest sound in the shop on any given Saturday. He went back to the Camaro. He moved the key to the ignition. Looked at Monica once. She was watching, coffee retrieved from the floor, both hands around the cup. Looked at Zoe, still building, but her eyes had come up from the Lego, because Zoe always knew when something was about to either work or not work, and she wanted to know which. He turned the key. The Camaro's ignition fired on the first try. Clean and immediate, the engine catching and settling into the particular voice of a rebuilt machine that had been done correctly. Not a struggle, not a hesitation, just the sound of something working exactly as it was designed to work, doing what it was built to do, running the way it was always supposed to run. Monica looked up from her stool. Zoe looked up from her Lego. Darnell stood in the middle of his father's shop and listened to the engine run and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the sound wasn't already saying. Some engines ran quiet when they were right. Not silent, the hum was there, the particular note of a healthy machine under no strain, everything in the right relationship to everything else. But it was the hum of a thing working the way it was meant to work, and once you knew that sound, once you'd heard it enough times to know it in your bones, you didn't confuse it with anything else. He looked at Monica. She looked back at him. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be. Some things you just listened to and let be what they were, and that was enough. And that was the whole point. And Darnell Cooper, 34 years old, son of James Cooper, father of Zoe Cooper, owner of Cooper Restorations since 1987, man who stopped for stranded cars on dark roads in the rain, because there was no version of him that didn't. Understood that as clearly as he'd ever understood anything in his life. He left the engine running. Outside, Atlanta was doing its Saturday thing, living and building and moving in all the directions that a city moved when it was actually alive rather than just occupied. West End in particular, with its particular character that had survived decades of pressure and the slow external forces that tried to replace its identity with someone else's idea of what the land was worth. The shop had held through all of it. The sign had held. The work had continued, because the work was what you did. Not to make a statement, not to prove anything to anyone, just because it was the thing that kept the thing going, and keeping the thing going was the job, and the job was worth doing, and some things were worth keeping, and the people who understood that were rare, and when you found one, you didn't drive past. Cooper Restorations. Est, 1987. Still there. Still running. Still the same letters his father had painted with the kind of careful that meant something. Refreshed twice and never changed. Catching the November light the way they caught every light. Quietly, without asking for attention, simply present in the way of things that have decided to stay, and then stayed through everything. The engine ran, the morning held, and that was enough.